Gunstar Superheroes is probably a game you haven't heard a lot about, which is a really sad thing given how good it is. Before you start the game, you can choose whether to play as red or blue, as well as your selection of difficulty. There's actually some differences between the characters that makes playing through it is each worthwhile. One of these differences are the weapons that they use. Red has a machine gun that shoots energy in short bursts, and blue has a gun that fires a constant current of lightning. For anyone who's played the Gunstar Heroes games of past, you'll feel right at home with the controls. You've got one to shoot and one to jump, but also by combining them with the shoulder buttons, you'll be able to pull off powerful moves like uppercuts and sword attacks. That's not all though, as the game goes even further by providing a means to floor everything on the screen with some devastating special abilities. For every hit you land, the gauge slowly rises, finally allowing you to unleash your power and stay in the fight. If there was one word that could sum up the gameplay, it would have to be smooth. Blazing across the screen is simple and fun. The fluidity of the controls is perfect for such a fast-paced side-scroller, and if graphics are a thing, then Superheroes delivers like no other GBA game. Not only do the effects like explosions, bullets and animations look spectacular on the small screen, but the character models and designs are colourful, full of detail, which really makes them shine. Gunstar Superheroes proves how solid game design remains a success. The controls are spot on and never feel cumbersome, the graphics are bright and full of action, and the audio will have you humming along in no time. If you can find it on the cheap, it is well worth adding to your collection. Bravemaster Special Attack Force is based on an anime of the same name that sees you taking on the role of a young man known as Haru. He loses his father in a battle against an evil empire, and as a result he sets out to find a mysterious object that possesses the power to overthrow them, and this is where the game kicks off. You get to choose between 9 characters and a couple of unlockable ones as you take the fight to the enemy. As you would guess, each of them possess a string of basic attacks, as well as individual special abilities known as battle cries that can turn the tide of fight in the blink of an eye. Battle cry moves have different effects for different characters, and they're good for when you need that extra attack range, speed, increased defense, or even limited invincibility. Each fight can involve a maximum of 4 characters, and most stages have multiple platforms and environmental hazards for the player to contend with as well. What helps it stand out is the inclusion of several minigames that pop up during each bout. One, for example, is a rapid button mashing task that's initiated by activating a character's special finisher move. If the instigator manages to press the buttons faster than their opponents, they'll all be laid to waste in a fiery outburst. Now when it comes to presentation, Bravemaster is a great looking GBA game with colourful and nicely detailed environments. You'll fight on the deck of a ship as it rocks from side to side, or even underwater as bubbles rise up as you fight. The characters are tiny but nicely detailed, but when they pull off a special move or you enter into one of the minigames, you'll get anime style renderings of the characters. Overall, it's nowhere near the best fighting game on the GBA, but one that's still worth giving a go if you've exhausted the other fighting options on the handheld. Racing Gears Advance is one of those gems that got lost in the storm of games that released for the GBA. Racing titles were a huge part of the handheld success, with the likes of Mario Kart or GT Advance. There were plenty of options for racing fans looking to play something on the go, and unfortunately Racing Gears just couldn't cut a piece of the pie. It reminds me a lot of the classic rock and roll racing games with its overhead isometric viewpoint of the action. However, don't let the somewhat basic look fool you, as things aren't as simple as they seem. The physics of the vehicles actually have a bit of depth to them. Depending on the attributes of each part on your vehicle, tires, engines, and turbo boosts can all be upgraded, and their stat levels heavily affect the type of environment you are racing on. For example, if you were not racing with a proper set of tires in dirt or snow, be prepared to expect a lot of skidding around the track. Occasional bouts of rain and snow also dramatically affect each race. Then to top it all off, there is the weapon system to keep in mind. It's not a full-fledged weapon system like there is in races such as Mario Kart, but it has a small selection of common items that you can buy, like rockets and mines among a few others. They do add to the gameplay, but in all honesty it feels a bit unnecessary, as the physics of the general driving are great on their own. One more aspect that helps Racing Gears excel even further is the inclusion of several shortcuts that are included for each track. This is a great way to reward the player who takes the time to seek them out and consistently utilize their usefulness in each race. While it's not the most visually pleasing title that appeared on the handheld, the racing itself had been glued to the screen for hours on end, and it was also perfect for quickly picking up for short bursts once I was busy. If you're like me and love racing games, then Racing Gears Advance is a must-have for anybody who wants a GBA. Rhythm Heaven on the DS was a huge hit that went on to become one of the most quirkiest games on the handheld. But what not many people know, however, is that it all began on the GBA. Sure, it doesn't have the advantage of extra control options afforded by the DS and its stylus, but it is still an absolute blast to play. The gameplay basically revolves around short, well thought out scenarios based around tapping certain buttons in time to the beat. This sounds much easier than it actually is, as you really have to be in tune with the audible and visual cues to get it spot on. Each stage throws you into some bizarre setups, acted out to the rhythm of the music. Some inspired examples include kicking flower pots, helping a rabbit hop across an ocean in time to a very bouncy tune, or trying to strike the right pose. In true Japanese fashion, many strange scenes will be scarred into your brain during the course of this game, as well as many insanely catchy tunes. If you aren't grinning from ear to ear by the time the credits roll, you clearly do not have a soul. Now visually, the graphics are purely down to personal taste. Much like the WarioWare games, the themes vary wildly in style and presentation. For everyone that loves this game for it, there will be someone else who hates it. For me, I find the aesthetic charming, and the bright, bombastic sprites lend the game a really unique look. Perhaps the only negative I could say about the game is that it's just too damn short. Skilled players wishing to experience all of the stages and nothing more will likely blast through it in one day. It just would have been nice to have seen more variety on offer and maybe a few more minigames to boot. Rhythm Tengoku is a great game that I can easily recommend to anyone who enjoyed the DS version, but also those who are fond of rhythm games in general. It's easy to pick up and play in short bursts, making it perfect for that next commute or bout of boredom. Mobile Suit Gundam Seed is one of the best fighting games on the GBA that never got its chance to shine. The handheld was no stranger to quality fighting games, and with the likes of Street Fighter and Tekken, Gundam Seed went by largely unnoticed. And it's a shame, as it manages to hit every mark and in some ways even surpass its contemporaries. Each character has an individual story that follows the events of the anime, and while the storyline is somewhat simplistic and the dialogue is very basic, it is a vast improvement over other fighters on the handheld that have virtually no plot at all. For fans of the source material, you'll be able to instantly jump in and recognize some familiar faces, whilst newcomers will actually have a bit of context as to why two hulking machines are fighting in the first place. When it comes to gameplay, it's your standard 2D fighting setup, with each of the face buttons and shoulder buttons corresponding to either a weak or heavy attack. This forms the basis of the combo system, which is easily the most engaging and enjoyable aspect of the game. As with most fighting games, each character has their own unique set of moves, so trying them all out for yourself is essential to find one that suits your style of play. Another staple of fighters is also present, and that are the super moves, which light up the screen in style as each pummels your opponent into oblivion. Finding the best way to utilize the combo system in conjunction with these super moves is the key to overcoming anything the game throws at you. Now visually, Gundam Seed looks beautiful on the GBA. The sprite work is incredibly well produced and gives each of the mech models a distinctive and believable presentation as each fight plays out. Couple this with the smooth animation and what you have is one of the best looking fighters on the GBA. If you're a fan of the series and fighting games, then this one is a no-brainer. That thankfully will also cater to casual fans due to its challenging and rewarding gameplay. Choo Choo Rocket began life on Sega Dreamcast and was met with marginal success. This didn't stop Sega from porting it to several platforms though, with it finding itself a new home on the Gameboy Advance. This wasn't some watered down port either, as all of the content from the Dreamcast version is present, as well as a few extras that would help entice those that had already played it. When it comes to gameplay, it's your job as the captain of the space rocket to guide the Choos to your rocket and safety. If a Choo runs into an arrow pad, it'll go in that direction the pad is pointing. However, you'll have to watch out for the evil space cats. If one enters your rocket, they eat a portion of your mice, and will also swallow up any Choos that run in their path. The beauty of Choo Choo Rocket is that it's so simple yet fun. All the great puzzle games never get very complicated, they end up being the most addictive. Choo Choo is one of those games that are perfect for picking up and playing in short bursts, only intending to play for say 5 minutes, but you might find yourself playing for an hour or more by the time you look up. I can't stress enough how simply addictive this game is. As with the Dreamcast version, there are plenty of modes to get stuck into, with multiplayer being a huge highlight. It supports up to 4 players, and only requires one person to have a copy of the game. Others include puzzle mode that sees over 2,000 stages being available to overcome, and finally stage creation, which essentially makes the game endless. If there was only one negative to throw at the game, it would have to be the controls when compared to the original version. Game Boy Advance doesn't have as many inputs, so several workarounds were put in place to overcome the handicap, and they work for sure, but it doesn't feel as streamlined, and it takes a bit of time to get used to. If you want a puzzle game that is challenging, and you have a Game Boy Advance in your hand, Choo Choo Rocket is definitely a title you should pick up. Juka and the Monophonic Menace is a rather unique adventure game for Game Boy Advance. It all focuses on Juka, a young alchemist that is slowly getting to grips with his art. After returning to his hometown to find his loved ones missing and soldiers not attacking it, he sets off to investigate the disappearances and uncovers a malicious plot by an entity only known as the Monophonic Menace. One huge detail in the game is how character-driven the entire adventure is. Across your travels, you'll come into contact with a cast of lovable NPCs and animals that will help steer you in the right direction and deal out story points that bring a real believability to the events that transpire. Now when it comes to gameplay, the action takes place from an isometric viewpoint, with plenty of locations to explore. With Juka being an alchemist, you're tasked with collecting various ingredients in order to conjure potions. You'll make your way through snowy mountains, forests and meadows, which each present their own unique threats as well as delights to take in. There's a ton of items that Juka needs to collect while on his travels. Still, even with all the objects you're required to snag, the game never feels like a fetch quest, as everything you collect has a purpose. The recipes for your potions start off quite simple, as you've only got 3 types of ingredients, but as you make your way through the game and gather more, you'll learn new recipes to help you out. Now even though the game has a huge emphasis on exploration, combat also has a huge role to play as you make your way about. You'll have to use a combination of Juka's alchemy and his sound staff to battle the various enemies. By absorbing attacks from your opponents, it's possible to build up your staff's energy and ultimately unleash it upon your foes. This type of battle starts off slow in the beginning, but as more enemies are introduced, each with their own strategies, the pace of each battle really picks up. Overall, Juka and the Monophonic Menace may not be for everyone, but if you like the sound of the unique gameplay and are fond of, say, the early Zelda games, there is plenty here to love. Guru Logic Champ is a unique and addictive puzzle game with a distinctive style. The gameplay is similar to that of Picross, in that you have to strategically place blocks on a grid to reveal hidden images. The difference is that instead of picking where you want to place the blocks on the grid, you can only fire the blocks up from the bottom of the screen. The hidden image on the grid is incomplete by a given number of blocks, which are conveniently represented by blank spaces. You are given just enough blocks to fill all of the blank spaces, no more and no less. Various obstacles may also appear on the grid, and they interact with your fired blocks in different ways. The main challenge comes from figuring out how to overcome these obstacles and correctly place the blocks you were given into the blank spaces. Once you have correctly placed all of the blocks, the hidden image is revealed and you move on to the next puzzle. Overall, there are 12 levels with a total of 335 puzzles. I can guarantee you will not breeze through this game in one sitting. Some of the puzzles may have the potential to frustrate you and leave you stumped for days on end. As far as motivation goes, there is a nice extra reward in the form of a totally different reflex-based minigame if you manage to complete all of the puzzles. There's also a multiplayer battle mode for up to 4 players, which ramps up the action and is quite possibly one of the game's best features if you're lucky enough to know someone who has it as well. Now when it comes to presentation, it's rather simple, with a very bright and colourful cartoon style that permeates throughout the game. On the whole, Guru Logic Champ is really hard to put down. The sheer amount of challenge it presents is enough to send the most proficient of players into a rage of frustration, but it never feels like the game's fault, but rather just your lack of skill, which just pushes you to get better. If you like Picross games, or you like Denki blocks, or you just consider yourself a fan of puzzle games in general, then I believe you'll love this one. Air Force Delta Storm originally released for the Xbox as a launch title and was met with critical acclaim. Konami's take on the Ace Combat series took the tried and tested formula and introduced many new ideas to help it stand out against its clear inspiration. This success no doubt prompted Konami to take a swing at producing a handheld version of the game, and while it is a completely different take when compared, it still manages to provide an enjoyable experience that can be played wherever you may be. The most common misconception about this game is that it's simply a top-down shooter, but there is so much more to the gameplay than just that. The developers factored in the Z-axis this to make the action take place in a three-dimensional setting. As a result, the directional pad will control your yaw and pitch of the aircraft rather than simply going forwards and backwards on the screen. This makes each and every dogfight a lot more challenging, as you have to account for the 3D space as well as their position. To do this, you've got to use the HUD to your advantage and keep an eye on your altitude in order to level up against the enemy. I'm not gonna lie, it is quite difficult at first, and you'll probably find yourself failing quite often, but once you've had a chance to settle into the game, it all soon becomes second nature. Naturally, there's several planes you'll be jumping into throughout the game, which all come with an assortment of weaponry to use. With the diverse types of missions to take on as well, there's a use for each and every single one of them. When it comes to graphics, the presentation is some of the best you'll see on the handheld, and the effect of depth that the developers achieved looks and more importantly runs flawlessly. Air Force Delta is definitely an acquired taste. As I mentioned earlier, when going into the simple yet complex gameplay, it'll likely throw some off. But for those looking for a completely different take on flying games, it's something that's worth checking out. The Game Boy Advance was well known for its abundance of great RPGs, and it doesn't get much better than Lunar Legend. First released on the Sega CD, it would later find its way to the PlayStation 1, and eventually this version here. Once again, it sees you taking on Alex of Berg's epic tale of hardship and adventure, ordered to save the love of his life as well as the kingdom. Sure, the story may be somewhat the same as before, but the inclusion of several new twists allows those familiar with it to experience something new. That wasn't the only new inclusion either, as a lot of changes were made to the gameplay itself as well. The biggest change comes from the battles. None of the original spells appear in this fourth remake of the Silver Star story, and replacing them for each character is a range of new spells and abilities to learn. Movement is gone entirely, leaving the battle system more turn-based, like a classic RPG. And while this might annoy some of the original fans, I for one think there was a much better approach. One major improvement as well with the graphics. It's all still sprite-based like the series has always used, but the level of quality afforded to each was actively increased. The sprites are bigger, more detailed, not mere clusters of colours on the screen like they were once before. On top of this, the animations were given the same amount of love, which makes seeing battles play out an absolute treat on the eyes. Of course, with the game now being supplied on a cartridge, several cuts were also made to the game that ultimately make it inferior to the originals. Mainly the FMV sequences and music suffered greatly, with cutscenes being replaced by anime portraits and the music being severely downgraded in order to fit on the cart. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but it does detract from the overall game, especially if you've played one of the previous versions. Regardless of this, Lunar Legend is still a solid RPG that is well worth picking up if you can find it on the cheap. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 3 as that will be coming up soon. So don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos, and share the show with your friends. You can follow me on all of the socials, which are linked below to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skill Jim, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Paul, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Curse Salaryman, and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.